Kentucky, mid-19th century. One night, silence was broken by a single scream, and then nothing. Henry Johnson, an African-American man who had spent his life in chains and humiliation, finally did what few dared. He killed his white neighbor. This was no random act of rage. For years, that man mocked him, spat at him, beat him just to prove power. Tonight, Henry struck back. His axe ended a laugh that had haunted him for too long and turned a lifetime of submission into one defiant moment. Henry Johnson entered the world already branded by chains. He was born in Kentucky in the early decades of the 19th century, a time when the soil demanded endless labor and the system demanded endless suffering. His first memories were not of freedom or discovery, but of the sting of winter winds cutting through a thin shirt, of hands raw from picking and carrying, of voices that ordered and struck without reason. Childhood for Henry was not a gentle season. It was work before the sun, exhaustion after it, and hunger that slept beside him each night. His family, like so many others, did not remain whole for long. Brothers and sisters were sold away, swallowed by auctions that treated flesh as currency. Henry remembered his mother's face as she was taken from him, a mixture of terror and resignation, like someone pulled into a storm she knew she could not fight. He was still a boy, yet the lesson was permanent. Attachments could be severed in a single moment, and grief was not a private sorrow but a public spectacle. Despite this, something inside Henry resisted. Outwardly, he bowed his head, did as he was told, absorbed the blows. But within, a quiet fire smoldered. He studied the men around him, learned how to bear pain in silence, how to move quickly without complaint. He became, in the eyes of those who claimed ownership, dependable. To them, he was nothing more than hands and muscle. Yet Henry knew that behind his obedience lived a mind that would not surrender. Seasons passed, and the rhythm of labor ground on. Cotton in the heat of summer, wood to be chopped in autumn, fields to be cleared even as snow hardened the ground in winter. Henry grew taller, his shoulders thickened, but he carried an invisible weight heavier than any load. It was the weight of enforced silence, of swallowing insult after insult, of keeping rage hidden where no one could see. Every strike of the overseer's whip, every command barked by a voice younger than him, carved deep grooves into Henry's memory. To those who laughed at his suffering, he seemed a man stripped of will. But inside, Henry's spirit whispered otherwise. He told himself that he was more than the work, more than the chains, more than the cruelty. He did not yet know how that belief would shape his future, but it was there, lodged like a stone in the soil, waiting. Among the daily burdens Henry carried, none weighed heavier than the shadow cast by his white neighbor. This man was not his master, not an overseer by duty, but someone who took delight in torment for its own sake. He lived close enough that encounters were unavoidable. Each meeting became a ritual of degradation. The neighbor would spit near Henry's feet, sometimes directly on his clothes, then laugh as though it were the cleverest joke. He hurled insults loud enough for others to hear, twisting Henry's name into something filthy. When he passed Henry on the road, he lashed out with a stick or struck him across the back, never because of any offense, only because he could. To him, Henry was not a man but a stage on which to perform his cruelty. What stung most was the way others joined in. Children pointed and repeated the neighbor's taunts. Women, walking by, covered their mouths to hide laughter. Each insult became a small wound, not on Henry's body but on his dignity. And in a world already designed to deny that dignity, such wounds cut deep. Henry endured it for years. He clenched his jaw, forced his body still, and walked away. Outwardly, he remained calm. Inwardly, the humiliation festered like rot beneath the skin. Every strike of mockery reinforced the message. He was to remain beneath them, voiceless and powerless. But every strike also planted another seed of fury. Sometimes, at night, Henry replayed the encounters in his mind. He imagined speaking back, imagined seizing the hand that dared strike him. But imagination ended where fear began. He knew too well what became of men who defied whites openly. Punishment could be swift and merciless whips, prisons, or death itself, and so he swallowed the rage, year after year. Yet the neighbor seemed to sense the hidden fire in Henry, and that only fed his cruelty. The more Henry endured, the more the neighbor pressed. It was as if he sought to break the last barrier inside him, to grind not only his body but his soul into dust. Henry could not escape this presence. Even when he tried to lose himself in work, the neighbor's jeering voice echoed like a chain dragged across stone. Freedom was not only denied by the system, it was mocked daily by the man next door. And that mockery, over time, became more unbearable than the chains themselves. Time has a way of stretching pain, turning small acts of cruelty into a chain that wraps tighter with each year. For Henry Johnson, the neighbor's torment became a calendar by which his life was measured. Seasons passed not by harvests or holidays, but by fresh humiliations. In the marketplace, the neighbor made Henry his example. Before a gathered crowd, he called out insults that stripped away every trace of humanity. "Beast," he would sneer, his voice rising above the noise of the street. "Look at him, strong as an ox but dumb as dirt." People laughed. Some turned away with pity, but most laughed. Each chuckle was a nail hammered deeper into Henry's chest. There were slaps, two delivered without warning, once in front of children, who shrieked with delight as if cruelty were a carnival. Another time, in front of women who whispered behind their hands but never protested. What the neighbor understood and what Henry could not escape was that humiliation was more devastating than the sting of a blow. Bruises faded, but the shame of being laughed at, of being reduced to nothing, lingered like smoke that would not leave his lungs. Henry became known as the man who never fought back. His silence was misread as weakness. To survive, he let it appear that way. But inside, silence was not emptiness. It was a reservoir filling to the brim. Every jeer, every shove, every mocking word was another drop. The vessel could not hold forever. Some nights, Henry would walk alone beneath the trees, his eyes fixed on the stars he could barely see through Kentucky's mist. He wondered if anyone in the heavens knew his name. Did God see him? Or had even God chosen to avert his gaze, the way neighbors did when cruelty played out before them? He carried himself like stone, unmoving, uncomplaining. But even stone cracks. He was no beast, though they called him so. He was a man forced to bury his voice, bury his pride, bury every natural instinct to defend himself. Years of it had hollowed him out, yet also sharpened him like a blade waiting to be drawn. By the time Henry reached manhood, he had endured enough humiliation to break 10 men. And though his body walked obediently through fields and forests, his soul kept asking a single question, louder each year. How long could a man be mocked before he ceased to be a man at all? In the stillness of night, when overseers slept and the fields lay quiet, Henry sometimes found himself in hushed company with others who bore the same chains. They gathered in shadows, voices low, as if even the trees might betray them. Conversations drifted from prayers to memories, from longing for families torn away to the crushing weight of tomorrow's labor. One evening, Henry spoke words he had never dared release before. "We're ghosts to them," he whispered. "They look right through us. We work, we bleed, and still we're invisible. They laugh at us as if we're shadows that can't fight back." A heavy silence followed. Some nodded slowly, eyes cast down, unwilling to feed hope that could not live. One older man shook his head. "Best to keep quiet, Henry. Quiet men live longer." Another, a young woman scarred on her cheek, muttered, "Quiet men die slower, too." The words lingered in Henry's ears. For years he had played the quiet man, and though his body survived, his spirit withered. He began to realize that silence was not safety. It was another form of bondage. Every day he swallowed his anger. Every night he sealed his lips. He was fastening the chains tighter around himself. From then on, his silence carried a different weight. It was no longer resignation. It was patience. He began to listen differently to the rhythm of the land, to the tone in the neighbor's voice, to the moments when cruelty reached its loudest. These were not just humiliations anymore. They were warnings. They were signals. Among those in the shadows, Henry spoke less but thought more. His eyes, once cast downward, began to lift. He noticed that others, too, carried sparks in their gaze. Most kept them buried. A few let them slip. Henry began to believe that silence was a cloak, not a cage, and cloaks, when cast aside, revealed what lay hidden beneath. Still, he made no outward move. He continued to work, to bow, to endure. But within, the fire grew hotter, and his patience became less like surrender and more like waiting for the storm. Henry had begun to understand. Words might not change his fate, but action could. And though he had not yet chosen his path, he knew this much: the day would come when silence would no longer protect him, and when it came, he would not be silent anymore. There are moments when cruelty becomes more than habit, it becomes theater, and one afternoon, the neighbor chose to make Henry his stage. It was a Sunday, a day when families gathered after church, when women wore their best shawls and children played at the edges of the road. Henry was passing through, carrying wood on his shoulder, when the neighbor stepped into his path. His voice, sharpened for the crowd, rang out. "Look at him," he jeered, pointing as though Henry were livestock on display. "Beast of burden, dumb as a mule, strong arms, empty head." Laughter rose from the onlookers. Children repeated the taunts in sing-song rhythm, their small hands clapping to the beat of humiliation. Women smirked behind their hands, pretending to pity him while enjoying the spectacle. The neighbor circled Henry like a predator circling prey. With each word, he pressed harder. He bent low, spat at Henry's boots, then shoved him with the back of his hand. "Bow lower," he commanded. "That's all you're good for." Henry froze. The wood on his shoulder grew heavier, not from weight but from the fire flooding his chest. His jaw tightened, his nostrils flared. For years he had carried insults silently, but this was different. This was not just cruelty, it was public humiliation, designed to strip him bare in front of women, children, and strangers alike. The crowd roared with laughter, but Henry heard none of it. His ears burned with the rush of blood, his eyes fixed on the man before him. For the first time, he did not lower his gaze. In that glare, something shifted. The neighbor, for all his bravado, faltered for half a heartbeat. He saw in Henry's eyes a blaze that words could no longer smother. Henry said nothing. He swallowed his fury, turned, and walked away. But those who saw his eyes would remember them. They were not the eyes of a beaten man. They were the eyes of a storm, held back only by a fragile dam. That night, Henry lay awake on his pallet, staring at the rafters of his cabin. He replayed the scene again and again, the laughter, the spit, the children's voices echoing. Each memory struck like a hammer. He clenched his fists until his nails cut into his palms. He knew something had changed forever. The world still saw Henry Johnson as a silent man, but silence, when pressed too far, is no longer silence. It becomes the thin edge of defiance, and once that edge cuts, there is no turning back. The night came without announcement, like any other. The air was cool, the moon veiled by drifting clouds. Henry was chopping wood in the yard, the familiar rhythm of the axe sinking into logs, steadying his breath. It was then that the neighbor approached, swagger heavy with drink and arrogance. "Still working, beast?" he sneered, stepping closer. "Can't you do anything but sweat and stink?" His words, sharp as ever, cut through the quiet. Henry said nothing. He lifted another log, placed it on the stump, raised the axe. But the neighbor wasn't finished. He shoved Henry hard in the shoulder. The axe wavered midair. "Answer me when I talk to you," he barked, voice rising. He slapped Henry across the face, the sting echoing louder than the blow itself, and then he laughed, the same laugh Henry had endured for years. Something in that sound snapped the fragile dam inside him. Henry's hands tightened around the axe handle. He felt its weight differently now, not as a tool but as an answer. His chest heaved, not with fear but with release. For years, he had buried every insult, every slap, every spit in the dirt of his silence. Tonight, the silence refused to bury one more. The neighbor stepped forward again, hand raised for another strike, but this time, Henry did not yield. The axe rose. A scream split the night, then was swallowed by stillness. The yard grew unnaturally quiet, as if the earth itself held its breath. The stars above seemed to blink out one by one, leaving Henry alone with the weight of what he had done. He stood motionless, chest heaving, the axe hanging in his hand. The neighbor lay crumpled at his feet, laughter silenced forever. For a long moment, Henry could hear only his own heartbeat, loud and furious, as if the sound itself announced his defiance to the heavens. It was not triumph, he felt, nor even relief. It was something deeper, more primal, the knowledge that a line had been crossed, that he had answered humiliation with finality. The silence of the yard was not peace, it was the pause before the storm. Henry looked up at the darkened sky, the clouds drifting heavy above. For the first time in his life, he was no longer the quiet man. He was the man who had struck back. And nothing, not even the weight of the world's judgment, could erase that moment. The next morning, whispers traveled faster than the sun across Kentucky's horizon. By the time the church bell tolled, the story had already spread. Henry Johnson, the quiet man, the one who bore humiliation without a word, had killed a white neighbor. To some, it was an unspeakable crime. To others, it was a secret flicker of hope that a man could refuse chains, even for a moment. The white community reeled in outrage. A dangerous example, they said. If one can do it, others may follow. The neighbor's body was carried through town like a grim warning, laid out so all could see the cost of defiance. People gasped, clutched their children, and muttered about the collapse of order. For Henry's people, the news spread differently. In hushed tones, with glances over their shoulders, they passed the story along. Henry had finally broken his silence. Some trembled with fear of what would come next: reprisal, punishment, blood. Others felt something harder to admit: pride. In a world where survival meant submission, Henry had shown a flash of dignity reclaimed, even if only for a heartbeat. The place where the act occurred became silent ground. No one wanted to walk near it. The soil seemed to remember. Some said they could still hear the echo of that scream, cut short in the night. Henry himself felt the weight of both worlds pressing on his chest. He did not revel in what he had done. There was no victory, no joy, no song in his heart. Only the sharp knowledge that the world would not forgive him. The act was done, but the price had only begun to reveal itself. Men rode out at dawn, rifles slung across shoulders, eyes scanning the horizon. They spoke of hunting not a man but a beast that needed to be put down. Every insult they had ever hurled at Henry now became justification for vengeance. Henry knew he could not stay. His hands shook as he gathered what little he had: scraps of food, a blanket, a tin cup. He looked once more at the cabin where he had lived in silence, then turned away. His footsteps into the forest were heavy but sure. He had crossed the line, and now every path forward was shadowed by pursuit. Behind him, the community boiled with rage, fear, and rumors. Ahead of him stretched wilderness-dense woods, rivers swollen with spring rain, swamps where the air itself felt like a trap. Henry walked into it all, with nothing but the fire that had once been silence. The manhunt began with the urgency of a war. Riders fanned out in every direction, dogs straining at their leashes, muskets glinting in the morning light. The cry went up from farm to farm: "Find Henry Johnson." To them, it wasn't just about capturing one man. It was about restoring a broken order, proving that defiance would always end in chains or in death. Henry moved quickly, deeper into the woods than he had ever dared. Branches clawed at his arms, roots snagged his feet, but he pressed on. He followed deer paths, drank from muddy streams, and tried to mask his scent with swamp water. Still, he knew the dogs would find him eventually. His only weapon now was distance. By night, the forest was his ally. He slipped through thickets where horses could not pass, crossed rivers in silence, leaving the current to swallow his tracks. Each time he heard a dog bark in the distance, his heart jolted, but he kept moving. He told himself, one more mile, one more step, one more chance. But the hunters were relentless. Their boots left deep prints in the mud. Their shouts carried through the trees. They lit torches that flickered like fiery eyes in the dark, searching for him. Each time they found a footprint, each time they spotted a broken branch, they shouted with triumph. "He's close!" Henry's body weakened. Days of flight left him trembling with hunger, his legs swollen, his breath ragged. He pressed on, driven not by hope of escape but by refusal to be caught easily. If they wanted him, they would have to chase him to the ends of the earth. The land bore his passage. Mud held the shape of his bare feet. Wet grass bent beneath his weight. Even the rain seemed to betray him, softening the ground and making his trail clearer. Some say he whispered to himself during those days, words not of prayer, but of defiance. "I am a man," he muttered. A man, not a beast. Those words kept him moving when his body begged him to stop. But the net was closing. Riders moved in tighter arcs, dogs bayed louder. The forest echoed with pursuit. Henry Johnson, once the silent man, had become the hunted man. And though he ran with all the strength left in him, he knew the world behind him would never stop chasing. When they finally caught Henry, the end was swift. The dogs had cornered him near a swollen creek, his body too worn to run farther. Exhaustion, not chains, finally brought him down. He was hauled back to town in silence, wrists bound, eyes hollow but unbroken. For days, he had outrun them. For years, he had endured them. Now he stood before them, and in that stillness there was more dignity than any rope could strip away. The trial was no trial at all. It was performance, a crowded room, white faces leaning forward with anger and curiosity. Henry had no lawyer. No one spoke for him. The charges were read aloud: murder of a white man. The words hung in the air like a death sentence already carved in stone. Witnesses were called, though none had seen the act itself. They testified not about the killing, but about Henry's silence, his defiance, his gaze that seemed too steady for someone of his station. They painted him as dangerous, not because of what he did, but because of what he represented: a man who dared to strike back. Henry spoke little. When pressed to defend himself, he said only, "He struck me too many times. He called me less than a man. I am a man." His voice was calm, stripped of fear. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then the judge banged his gavel, as though trying to crush even those words. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. The verdict was as inevitable as the sunrise: guilty. The sentence, death. It had been decided long before Henry entered the room. Outside, word spread quickly. Some felt reassured the system had reasserted control. Others whispered Henry's name in secret, turning it over on their tongues as if it were more than a name, as if it were a spark. For them, his fate was not simply punishment. It was warning and inspiration entwined. When Henry was led back to his cell, he carried himself not as a condemned man, but as one who had finally spoken with his hands what his voice had been forbidden to say. He had no illusions about what awaited him. Yet in his stillness, he looked almost at peace. The silence he had once borne as chains was now something different, an armor no sentence could shatter. Henry Johnson's life ended as the system intended, with punishment, with erasure, with his body claimed as proof of white authority. His name was written in court records as a criminal, his story framed as a cautionary tale of rebellion crushed. To those who ruled, he was the danger they warned of, the spark that must be stamped out. But stories have a way of slipping through cracks. Among the enslaved, Henry's act lived on. His name was whispered in cabins at night, not with fear, but with quiet admiration. He said enough, some murmured. He showed them we are men, not beasts. For people forced into silence, his defiance was more than violence. It was a reminder that the human spirit could not be whipped into dust forever. To the outside world, Henry vanished quickly. His grave was unmarked, his life folded into the endless ledger of bondage. Yet within that ledger, his story carried weight. He had not escaped, but he had stood. He had not won freedom, but he had claimed dignity. Even in death, he left behind a question that could not be buried. Which is the greater crime, one man's desperate strike, or the system that demanded his lifelong humiliation? Today, his name is rarely spoken in history books. Yet if you listen closely to the echoes of the past, you can still hear him. Not in the shout of defiance, but in the silence that followed, the silence that turned into whispers, the whispers that fed into movements, the movements that finally broke the chains. Henry Johnson was not a hero in the way statues define heroes. He was a man who broke under the weight of cruelty, who chose action when endurance became impossible. But in that choice, he embodied something larger, the refusal to remain invisible. His axe was not only a weapon, it was a statement carved into history for those willing to see. His story leaves us with a haunting question. When dignity is stripped, when humanity is mocked, when silence is demanded, what is left for a man to do? If stories like Henry Johnson's move you, subscribe to Murder Files Television, because silence never protected the oppressed, only truth does.